And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Frank Angiolelli, who is a managing director for the mSOC, and one of the, is a good friend and one of the most knowledgeable people that I know personally. And I don't know if it carries a lot, a lot of weight, and knows about managing security operations centers. So, Frank, thanks very much for joining me today to the show. Looking forward to having this conversation. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, David. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and discuss security operations and incident response. As we know, it's a topic I really love.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely have a passion about that. You and I met, quite a few times in person, and every time that I've spoken with you, my brain went boo, because there's something I did not know about Security Operations Center and the intricate involvement in enterprise and the interaction between the enterprise and the SOC. So before we get started, I love to ask this question. How did you get started in cybersecurity? What was your path?
So my path, I started as a programmer on my own, and then I got into computer hardware repair way back in the day. We're talking, Windows 3.1. And then I started doing networking. And once I moved on to networking, I started discovering bad things and investigating them. And it turned out that was what threat hunting and security operations is called now. And I started writing snort signatures, and this is way back in the day, around 2000, 2001 type area.
Do you still have the floppies for the Windows 3.1 somewhere in the office?
I have video games for a Commodore C64 on disk, 5.25-inch floppy.
I thought I'd ask. I knew you were probably going to say yes. So, by the way, this conversation is totally unscripted. So anything I tackle Frank with, just it's live, unscripted, and he's doing a great job in answering these. So, what made you? Were you always that curious in terms of like taking things apart? It sounds like you were kind of like tinkering in the early days, which is really impressive because there were not YouTube videos on how-tos and all that stuff. Everything had to be learned basically from scratch, or logging into some BBS, if people still recall that, and trying to uncover how to do these things. It was very difficult back then.
That's right. There was very little available for tools. There really were no instructionals, and so you had to develop it on your own and poke into things. Even the documentation that existed for what it would be and forensically how to analyze it just didn't exist. So a lot of creativity, a lot of trial and error. And ultimately, I think that served me pretty well because I get dropped into situations doing an incident response where nothing exists. We have to build. And so I've got some practice doing that. And I'll make you laugh. The first time I did packet inspection, there really wasn't a good way to view it, and I ended up printing a session. This is really a long time ago, Windows NT days, printing a session and sitting down and reading through it and highlighting it, making notes. Before any tools existed, I wanted to understand it. And people may ask, like, what's the passion? What charged me? Well, if a virus got on one of these systems, I absolutely wanted to know exactly how it got on there. Mostly because that's my system. Why did you get to run something on it? I want to know. So I want to stop you. And now I just do that on an enterprise level. Like, this is the enterprise's network. You're not allowed on here unless you're allowed. And I want to find you and kick you out.
Let me ask this question again. Were you printed like a whole session on a dot? I'm assuming it was a dot matrix printer.
I think it was one laser printers. This is like the old HP4Js with the big wide connectors.
How many pages were those?
It was like this thick, David. And I went to a local bar which served a really good chicken parmesan. That's exactly how you get me to go somewhere. And I ordered a chicken parm and a Bacardi and Coke, and I sat down. I flipped through because I wanted to sit down and study it. I really wanted to understand exactly what it was doing. And that was the only real tool available at that moment. And after that, I understood it so well that you could bring it up on screen, you could output it in 20 different ways. And I understood what it was. It's almost like you don't know what you don't know. And as you research through it, you get to know it better and faster. And then you know what tools you need, and you understand how to do it. It's like that unconscious competence you sort of build up to over time.
Do you think that the kind of the new up and coming generation of threat analysts or whatever, they are spoiled, so they have all those tools, as you mentioned, because they don't have to do what you did. They don't have to eat the chicken parm necessarily to do all the work that they're doing. But what's your take on it? Is it because in the fact that you had to do it by hand, and I've noticed that some programmer jobs require you to, for example, write a program just using a pen and paper, right? So to have that old school mentality, we can actually do this. Do you think to be able to do that in the early days allowed you to have that proficiency and insight that today's analysts don't have, just because they're kind of being lazy but pampered by all these tools available to them?
That's a really excellent question. I'll tell you, as I go around the country training SOC analysts or interfacing with their teams, one of the big things that I do help them through is when they say, we can't do that until we have X, whatever X is, name it. And I'm happy to show them how they can. And what's really powerful about that comes from a message my pastor used to say to me every Sunday in his homilies. He would say, the easy way is the hard way, and the hard way is the easy way. Meaning, if you can get the data before you have the tools, then you know exactly what you need from the tool. So many times we work with vendors and they'll say, this is what our tool does, and you look at it. When we do that and we work with clients to help mature them, we say, this is the features from a tool that you need. Let's go find the right tool. And that's a much more powerful discussion, particularly from a business standpoint and ROI. And if you can teach an analyst to do that and think about it that way, you can grow them straight on a path towards being unburdened by the need of a tool, that precursor, and to overcome those hurdles. It's really powerful when you do it.
Yeah, it's almost reminds you of the Karate Kid movie, like where they have to overcome. You have to. I mean, seriously, in all the seriousness, they have that impact. That training, that basic training to understand it and then apply that in the higher level is key. And I'm assuming that philosophy you have from inception, from the early days, still exists today. So maybe, how did you? I'll ask you the next question. How would that? How would you become a business owner? Like, I mean, you were serving, helping companies, assisting them with the kind of the security operations centers and incident response and so on. And then you decided to basically open up, jump into the deep end and open up your own business. Maybe talk to me about that journey, if you can.
Absolutely. Marianne Williams has a great expression: do what you love and the money will follow. And I did computer repair for about 3 years, and I left that job and I said, I want to think about what I want to do. And people started calling me, Frank, can you come? We want you. We want you to do this work. Okay. And then in security, I'd have a conversation with somebody and they would say, I got this problem, X, Y, Z, and I'd start talking about it. Not because I studied it, not because of a book, not because of a tool, just because I poked around and studied it and I discussed the story. What's the story? Tell me a story. And I'd tell them a story. Hey, I ran into that problem here. And they said, can you come and do our security? And so my first business, my first technology business, I was brought into by accident. People just said, no, we want you to come and do this. And that business grew for about 10 years. Same thing with security operations, even before it was SOC. I went to an interview at a very large financial and they hired me on the way home. And I said to myself, well, maybe I know a thing or two about this topic. And right. And that's kind of how it went. And so, David, the last thing I'll share is I've got a background in emergency services. I'm a retired ambulance captain, EMT fireman. We take cybersecurity and emergency services and you fuse them together. It makes a sandwich called incident response. And so everywhere I went, they were like, do incident response.
Yeah. And no wonder. I think it seems like you have that that cool and collected demeanor that I would like to have you on my side when shit hits the fan. Absolutely. And so let's talk about the evolution. I want to touch upon something. You mentioned before it was incident response, or SOC, was in existence. What was you're the best person to ask this question. When did it become a security operations center? Like, what was the evolution for that? Because it wasn't called that before. There were just a bunch of people running around, and then all of a sudden it became a SOC at some point. What happened there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of that evolution really became around the centralization of logs. And when that happened, people were building up, like back in the day with Greenplum, Postgres on Hadoop type databases, or, they were just putting them in flat file or something of this nature, basic syslogs. And as that started to evolve, number one, folks began to question the logs, abnormal versus normal. How do we even make that determination? There's actually a lot of complexity behind that. It's a fun problem to solve. Then the second issue is, as they begin to discover what the problem was, they said, well, in order to investigate that, we're going to need our DNS logs. They say, oh, go get me DNS logs. And then we started to realize, hey, maybe we need a proxy. And all of this kind of evolved into a situation where at each step, we collected logs, we found how to fuse it, set up alerts, and then investigate using that context. And so a lot of people were calling it a critical incident response center, or then the concept of a fusion center came out. And then after that, folks realized that sometimes the alerting that's in place from the vendors doesn't quite do it. That's reactive. It's in place. And so they started proactively looking at stuff, and they started to call that threat hunting. And I remember when threat hunting first started, and I said, oh, that's what we're going to call this. Right. So, I've been doing it for like 5 years, digging through logs, studying. My background is not just cybersecurity, but also a little bit of data science. So, I love studying data. And when this phrase threat hunting came out, okay, that's what we'll call that. And it's evolving as we mature as an industry.
And what does it look like today? For the people that are not familiar with the, because I'm sure there's a lot of people in the audience here that have never been or stepped in a security operations center and don't have an idea of what that looks like. Would you be able to describe it? Is it like something you've seen in movies, like, the NASA with all the screens and stuff before the launch? Is that something like that? Or is it just, I'm fantasizing over here?
No, totally. You're spot on. So what I'll share with you is a little bit of insight. I've been to some of the larger SOCs and have built several myself, where we have theater seating and screens all up, plus our workstations. Those really do help provide some real-time telemetry.
Do they have, in the seatings, do they have places for cups where you can just put in your, the large iced tea? Or is it like that?
That's pretty mandatory. I'm not sure everybody chooses iced tea.
We'll keep it, G-rated.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I'll share with you, David, as I'm looking at you, I'm in my office and there are 5 screens in front of me right now. I have 2 larger ones mounted up on my wall, and I have 3 in a wraparound. And that's first so that I can maintain eyes on ball across the board. A lot of my team members operate like this. We do want blinking, flashing lights. And then sometimes when you're conducting an investigation, it's nice to be able to pull different data up on different screens and work. I still do get my hands dirty in this area. I still dig into logs. And it can be pretty exciting, mostly because as opposed to a lot of other areas in technology, security operations, we never have the initiative. Meaning we're responsive, we're reactive. Unless we're doing threat hunting, then we're proactive, but the adversary picks the timing. And then about that adversary is a sentient being. Meaning, for example, from a data science perspective, it's interesting because you can detect abnormal behavior in IT because it is not a sentient being, it's a closed system, it should operate the same way every time. But with adversaries in cybersecurity, the data science modeling is completely different because your adversary is actively trying to avoid you, and they're adapting constantly. And we even measure the speed at which adversaries adapt their techniques. It's super interesting if you like that kind of work. But when you wake up in the morning and you're looking at a screen in a SOC, you could walk into nothing, or you could walk into a very serious incident that changes your perspective. I know folks that have sat in a chair for 72 hours straight because they're dealing with an incident. You never know when it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I have so many questions. So you were basically sitting there, it almost akin to cops. There are walking around Times Square, and all of a sudden something's happening, and they might be walking around Times Square for 72 hours or whatever, nothing happens, and all of a sudden it's just or like for 10 hours and something happens and they have to chase the bad guys. What does that look like in the SOC where you get like an alert? What happens then? Do you have to triangulate? Do you have to figure things out? And then do you have that, like the red phone where you call in like the customer or whoever that is? If you're an enterprise, you call in your boss or the boss's boss to tell them something's up. What does that process look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first off, if my team is calling me, I need to pick up the phone. I know why they're calling me. Mm-hmm. And if I call a chief security officer, they know they need to pick up the phone. And that's because something's sort of happening. And so as you're investigating on alert, very often it's they call it analyst fatigue. You're doing what's called triage. You're looking at the alert and saying, this is probably nothing. That doesn't matter. But then you do get that moment where you're looking at something and it's very serious. And you have to start making decisions. There's a lot of technology to support us, but ultimately it's an analyst's decision. You're looking at something and saying, this is so serious, I need to take action right now, or this is so serious, I need to investigate further. And then you're making decisions. You can correlate data automatically. You can synthesize data through source, but when you're looking at a serious adversary, it's the analyst that's going to make the decision and say, I need to quarantine this system immediately. David, we've had ransomware outbreaks come out on a Friday afternoon, and we have to knock them down in minutes. Otherwise, it gets really bad. And that's a rush of adrenaline. It's kind of like being a fireman and being an EMT. It's sometimes hours of boredom interrupted by sheer moments of terror. Terror is really not the right word, but that's the expression in the fire service. It's like when that happens, that's when we earn our pay to respond quickly, to realize it's a serious problem and what level it's at. A lot of soft skills there.
And are you under fear of crying wolf sometimes where, you're going to, we're in doubt whether you should alert or not? Is that something, and that also, you can find that in different professions as well. Do you call an ambulance or do you don't call an ambulance? You have to make that decision call. And if you call them and nothing happens and all of a sudden they blame you for wasting resources. Is this also the case here?
Yeah, completely. So if, one of the big problems in the industry is people are drowning in data and producing too much noise. And so one of the primary focuses, the mission of mSOC, as we go, is accuracy. If we escalate something, we want to make sure it's worthy of investing time. The business aspect of a cybersecurity operations center is if we send out requests to folks to do stuff, we're spending business resources. And we're pulling people sometimes off of projects or other activities. So we should have a good justification for doing that. And making that determination isn't always a technology decision, and it sometimes isn't a single analyst decision. So we all work together to identify, hey, this is worthy. From an accuracy perspective, we've aimed as an organization to be in the high 90+%. Sometimes approaching above 95% in terms of accuracy for true positives. But we also look at other stuff to make sure that we are seeing new adversary attacks. And that's how we discover some of the stuff that I've published in the past. The push bug work that led to a Brian Krebs article and some of the patented work I've done in counterfeits. We want to be able to look broad enough, be accurate enough, but not pull a fire alarm and walk down the hall with with a drum, beating everybody up. And that's an interesting balance, something you attenuate almost like a tuning fork over time.
And just to reiterate like a point that you made, you mentioned the 95% accuracy or upper 90s, right? It sounds like a lot, but what is kind of the normal, like, or the industry standard? I maybe we should touch upon that, because those numbers sound high, but I don't know if we should emphasize that. What are kind of the normal numbers that we see in this industry in the SOC?
That's a great question, David. Yeah. So assessing SOCs across the country, a very common metric we see is for every 1,000 alarms, there's 5 true positives. So that's a 0.5% accuracy rate, which is rather low. It's usually an opportunity to improve. Some of the higher functioning SOCs that we see achieve something like a 10 to 15% accuracy, meaning 1 out of every 10 alerts they're seeing is a true positive. The rest of them are noise. There's an investment and cost issue there, because you're paying 10 times the number of analysts that you need if you were only detecting the true positives. SOCs will never live in that world. Then when we escalate, it's that metric that comes up to the sort of 90%. If you're escalating 20 actionable items for people to do things every week, and none of those turn out to be true positives, there's an opportunity to improve there. It's an important metric. We track that metric as an organization. We report that metric to our clients, which is pretty unique. And, we achieve very, very high numbers compared to the industry, which we're kind of proud of.
And just speaking of cost, I want to raise something here. Looking at industry-wide, the enterprise, the cost associated with running and maintaining and upkeeping a SOC is very high. So, you typically don't see that in, small to medium-sized businesses, despite the fact that they would like to have one. Why? And you kind of touched briefly upon why is it so costly, but why is it so costly? When you look at why not have more of these, around the enterprise?
That's a good question. So first, part of that cost structure is built around the fact that we're operations. It's different from governance. It's possible in a smaller organization to have a single FTE or half an FTE run a governance risk and compliance department. They're reaching out to other people, assessing, and providing them with action items. In security operations, we've got folks that are hands on keyboard, and there is a lot of work to do. It's ever evolving. And we have to collect logs and log store. So the average organization will keep, a certain number of days, maybe a few months, hot, and cold storage for longer term. When you're ingesting 2,000, 5,000, 50,000 events per second, it's expensive to store that. You need to build an engine, like a SIM, to wrap around that, and a SOAR maybe to help automate. That's expensive too. And then we have the security controls, and there's a lot of them that need to be wrapped together in order to protect all the different angles of attack. So we have the equipment costs, licensing costs, operations, maintenance, storage, and then eyes on glass. And while automation is helping bend that cost curve down, we can see across the industry, even the increase of engineering spend isn't necessarily translating to outcomes. So it is a complex beast. Security operations is something I studied for like 4 months. That led to one of my wikis, psychology, which I don't have up right now. But when you study it, it's a really complex operation. It's fun.
Mm-hmm. And, it's super interesting because you mentioned automation, right? So, why is automation not, has not delivered the promise, right? So why is not SOC completely automated by now? We have quote unquote machine learning, AI, and the rest of it. What's stopping? And there are a lot of tools out there, a lot of companies that were taunting the fact that they can actually solve the problem. So why we're not there yet?
That's a really good question. So first off, if we abstracted sort of what you're looking for in data science is, you might be looking for things like long tail or anisotropism, which when you're looking at big logs, maybe you're tempted to look at top 10. Well, that's not necessarily what you want to be looking at because the vendors are telling you it's bad, but it's not necessarily bad. Is it bad for you? That's the real question. Is it bad in your organization? And we might look at the rare stuff. Well, the rare stuff doesn't necessarily indicate it either. It's hidden somewhere in the middle. And so to sort of distill that down, it's difficult to detect sentient adversary activity simply by using statistical analysis. It's got to be a supervised learning model. That's part of what I did in the counterfeit work, which I studied for a couple of years and produced some systems that do this. So we can't just turn it on and have data science algorithms that discover this, because the signal is commingled very closely into the noise. And that differentiation is both dependent on what the organization has, what kind of parsing they have, and ultimately what's abnormal in that organization. And typically, there's got to be some level of human involvement in all of that. You can use machine learning and AI to increase your velocity of what you're doing if you're doing it well, but it doesn't displace the need at some point for some human decision making and understanding before you turn on those algorithms.
So in layman terms, it's almost like the signal to noise ratio is not there, meaning that, if you look at trying to figure out who, which person is the adversary, they all look the same. They all look like, maybe wearing, jackets with different shades of black, but it's super hard to figure out who's. It's not like you can say, okay, they're wearing orange jacket or wearing yellow jacket, and we can pick them up from the crowds. It's just not happening, and this is why they require that kind of finesse, somebody who is able to almost like have a sixth sense and review, and have seen a lot of these grayish jackets, right? Is that a correct statement? That's why it's so tough to get that. Mm-hmm.
David, good abstraction is, it's like playing Where's Waldo, except everyone on the page is wearing red and white.
I love that. That's what I was looking for. Just so the people are not like, because you provided scientific explanation, which is amazing. But just for the people that the audience is not totally familiar with that. I love that. So what happens when everything fails? You build this amazing SOC with all the monitors, and you spend a lot of money. You get the qualified people on board. You got people managing it. You got the whole structure, and yet, they just don't uncover what they need to. What happens then?
What happens, well, from an outcome or from a business perspective?
Well, I would say both. I would say I'm interested to find out, is there a blow up? Is there something that is really happening, or what's the outcome? Like, and the question is, there's always a risk and a reward. Maybe you would say, okay, I don't need to have one, and I'll deal with the consequences. So if the consequences are not that great, maybe I'll just let somebody else have a SOC. I wouldn't worry about it right now.
Yeah, and offloading that cost onto cyber insurance probably isn't going to work out in the long run for the industry. The cyber insurance is kind of, they're experiencing a little bit of pain. And so what happens when it fails? Well, I've seen a lot of organizations do this outsource cycle over a couple of years. So they insource it and they say, this isn't working well, let's insource it. And they spend a few years. This isn't working well, let's outsource it. And kind of goes back and forth. And that's an indicator that there's probably some root cause problem there that we want to get down to. The second one that's a really good indicator is if you're running penetration tests or red teams and you don't see them. And if you don't see them, we want to understand why. Because that could be an indicator that you have some sort of a problem. And then we always have the possibility of this really rough event. I mean, doing SOC, one of the challenges is if you miss an adversary, it can go really bad. Front page sort of stuff, and then everybody has a bad day for a few months. And then the really, really bad scenarios, you don't know that you've missed them, and you don't know you've missed them for a long time, and you wind up with, perhaps an organization someplace else in the world manufacturing precise duplicates of what you designed, and that's the most costly to a business.
So short answer is not good. That's what.
Yeah, you really want to do. And it's not about the complexity, David. A lot of people focus on, hey, what if I API the blockchain to my machine learning? Use two-factor, right? Deploy your firewalls, configure them well, monitor DLP, deploy DLP. Most of the time, David, folks have tools that we can leverage, and they don't have to purchase new ones. And then we'll produce some metrics for them that show them what's going on, and then tell them, here's your targeted investment. And that's a gap, I think, across the industry right now, something that we're hoping to help improve. How do we translate this stuff into meaningful investments at the CFO level type stuff?
Very cool. And so how do you manage, how do you, kind of the inverse of that was, how do you manage to make sure that you do a good job of managing a SOC if you wanted to have it in-house? Are there any particular key matrices or things that you can focus on to make sure that you're running it well and it produces the outcome you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. So one metric certainly to monitor for is how many incidents per week or per month. And if you measure that over time, you can get a sense for what the baseline is, the organization, how many true positives you're detecting, like real true positives that you have to take action on. If that number is 100% and thousands per week, that's a different business issue versus if it's manageable, 1 or 2, 5 or 6, or if it's 0. And if it's 0, that's a different kind of problem. And those help organizations understand, do you have the right level of staff? Look, most SOCs are understaffed. We know that. And part of that is, how do you measure it in order to demonstrate to the business? The biggest gap that I keep hearing when I talk to chief security officers about funding something like a security operations center is, how do they make the justifications? How do they go to the CFO, CIO, and justify this is what the spend is? And that's something that I like to help organizations with, because we need it. CFOs know we need it, but it's difficult to know where to direct that spend. So metrics helps, and understanding and aligning to the business really helps too.
So it's interesting. So how do you handle that conversation? Because a lot of times, the C-level executives, I mean, as you mentioned, they're aware that they need one, but the majority of them, unless they're like, the CISOs level or whatever, they haven't really, seen one or touched one, or it's almost like telling them that, hey, you need to, get a car, but they still take the subway. They haven't really experienced, riding in a car. And it's depending also like the maturity level of the organization. How do you handle that conversation to make them understand it? And then how do you ease them into the idea? And maybe talk to me about, for example, engagement with mSOC. What's that engagement looking like for somebody who doesn't have a SOC but wants to dabble in SOC and maybe get some of the services you provide?
That's a great question. Yeah, thank you. So when we onboard and sort of start up with security operations, we don't necessarily tell people that they need to deploy new tools, but we do want to collect the logs and start turning on alerting. What that usually becomes is some level of understanding about what security incidents are happening at the organization. And while a lot of SOC analysts and SOC engineers are super interested in advanced attacks and engineering APT threat actors, the CFOs and the CIO are kind of interested in what's going on. And if you can describe that at a high level, hey, here's what's going on. Your users have a propensity to click on phishing links. That's a story they can understand. And they say, what do I do about that? Oh, well, we'll deploy this phishing filter, this security awareness training, and then you measure it over time, and you'll start to see that curve start bending down. Well, there was less of that thing that was causing a problem that they understood. And we can show that on a metrics chart. And usually at that point in time, they say, I understand it. What do we need to do next? And we'll do that next. And over time, what happens is the organization matures. David, I'd love nothing better than to say, on board with mSOC, we'll push an easy button and you'll be fixed. It's a little bit more complex than that. And I think that's why we're having a challenge in SOC in the industry. It's not quite that easy, but you can get measurable benefit from it.
And how do you assess their maturity level when you initially have initial conversation? And by the way, so this conversation is live, and Frank has to answer his phone since he's running an operations center. So
I'm a popular guy.
You know, and you got to check to see you can't turn it. That's the downside is you can't turn your phone off.
Never. Yeah.
You know, never. So how do you assess, you know, what the mature level of the organization, and maybe tell me a bit of maybe a story of something that, you know, maybe like your first deployment or, you know, engagement, and then you uncover a few things that did not know about, because I think that's a real value, is to have that insight in terms of what happens, and executive cannot get enough of that. It's all about control. It's all about seeing what's happening to the business.
Yeah, I'll give you a tactical story, David, might help. So we began an assessment for an organization, and that was a light touch beginning so that we could sort of demonstrate for them the value proposition of this overall and of our services. And we analyzed their anti-malware logs. And rather than that sort of high level story where you say, yeah, you get 200 events or 100 events per month, we were able to research what was hitting them, what their anti-malware was detecting on, what types of viruses those were, where they were coming from, and how to modify user behavior to reduce that in their organization. And then we talked about how they could see what we were seeing on the screen, but there's a potential for some of those not getting blocked. And what does that look like? And so if we could bend the curve down to change their user behavior, and they could understand where their problem was. In that specific instance, their problem was users going to a search engine, typing download, say, WinSCP, some other tool, download, you know, whatever, PuTTY. And they were clicking on the first link, and it was, you know, download putty.superevilwebsite.com. Instead of downloading it from the legitimate place, they were downloading it from there. And we knew that could advise the business based off nothing but hunting through some of their antivirus logs. And it's that type of squeezing that grape to get the value out of what is this? What does it mean? And what should the organization do about it, that we hope to be able to help organizations with?
Yeah, it's amazing. So it sounds like you're not just providing like the kind of the incident response, like reviewing of something that happens. You also provide insight, the intelligence to look at things and then provide insight to how to fix them and be very proactive around that, which is, again, I don't think it's trivial when people think about SOC is an engine to make your organization more secure and provide risk reduction overall, right?
Yeah, it's anybody can tell you that a virus is found. Where did it come from? What does it mean? What can the organization do about it? What investments should you make? And should you make those investments? There's a whole story that goes behind those things. And so when you know, we have a series of really high-powered analysts, and when we work with organizations, we can help them interpret that data. It's almost like finding more meaning from the data than the new was there before. And again, that's part of the reason why the AI world doesn't on its own, just on its own, solve this problem, because it means different things in different organizations. Changing user behavior, increasing controls, investing in the right tool. It's that story. It's not just about finding malware. It's far much more than that.
Absolutely. You know, I see now ransomware is, you know, in the news. It's rampant, right? What can you do as, you know, as somebody who's running a SOC to potentially prevent or at least protect organization from getting hit? Because the number is just staggering. Every, you know, so many seconds an organization is getting hit in the US, at least in ransomware, and the consequences are severe.
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of this is hitting smaller businesses that we don't hear about, and it really hurts when it hits them. There's a larger attacks that we see that are serious. They impact infrastructure. Many of these attacks can be mitigated or blocked by using really solid, well-configured controls. I was working with an organization that had an anti-malware suite, and that anti-malware suite could help protect them from ransomware, and it was very well configured. And that helps reduce the risk. In addition to that, we believe that there's a conversation to have around being able to recover. there's a lot of ways that ransomware can be launched. Some of those are commodity. They're simple. I clicked on a phishing link and really bad things happen. Some of them are far more advanced, where there's an adversary targeting you. And so starting with that solid hygiene, deploying tools, configuring them well. And if you can, test them. See if they launch. But at a minimum, make sure you've got the backups. Make sure you can recover. And think about whether they would be impacted in a ransomware attack. Some pretty good advice.
And the other advantage of using a service like yours over doing it in-house is that you are seeing trends across the board,
Yes.
right? So you're looking at, it's almost like, bringing it down to simple examples is like, okay, I'm a plumber who's seen many types of faucets and many types of configurations. So I can go ahead and install a faucet in 15 minutes. If I tried to install a faucet, it would take me half a day because it's the first time that I've tried it. So
Yes.
You're laughing because I don't know. Have you tried to install a faucet yourself? I mean,
if it doesn't have an internet connection, I don't know what to do with it.
But is that the case?
Yeah, 100%. So we'll get on a call with some folks. Maybe we're doing an assessment for them, and they'll have a particular type of EDR or endpoint detection and response, and they'll talk to us about it, and we'll rattle right off the top of our head. We know what's good. We know what's bad. Here's the right way to configure that. Because ultimately, myself and my team have worked in virtually every single cybersecurity control that's out there. And we've deep dove in it. We even understand it from a logging perspective. We go back to vendors and we tell them, here's where you want to configure it, XYZ. It's that depth that we want to focus on as an organization. SOC in and of itself, threat hunting, incident response is a world unto itself. And what we like to work with organizations that want that depth, want that focus, and we can usually demonstrate it to people in our first consultation. Yeah.
Phenomenal. So, Frank, it's been a real pleasure to have you. Really fascinating. I think we should do these sessions again where we maybe talk about some, specific use cases of things that you found across the board. What's the easiest way to find you and maybe just, consulting, just to get some more idea of mSOC and the services? What's the easiest way for to get a hold of you?
Yeah, thanks, David. We try to make people's life easy. So if you go to msoc.io, which is our website, there's a button that says schedule a call right up on the top. Click it, pick a date, pick a time, invite will come. And at that date and time, you'll be on the line with a SOC expert.
Awesome. And as you mentioned, there's the ability to do like a light engagement where you can just start reviewing, logs that they've already been collected, right? And then you can just provide consulting in terms of how to make the collection a little bit better. In case of emergency and incident response, you're better protected. Is that also the case?
Yeah, definitely, David. It's kind of hard to walk into an organization and say, hi, we do a SOC, give me millions of dollars. It's much easier to start by, hey, let's toe into the water. Let's take a look at a few things. We'll demonstrate some value. We'll gain your trust. I mean, at the end of the day, we believe that we can prove it over time. And starting small is usually a good way to do that. We'll demonstrate what that value looks like. And my hope is that, and the outcomes kind of show that customers are usually impressed with what we can provide them with using just what they have. And we hope they get value out of it.
Awesome. And Frank, kudos to the success of mSOC. And you came a long way since you were, fixing computers and reviewing sessions by hand. Really long way. And you can tell that you're passionate about what you're doing, and it shows. And as you mentioned, if you do what you like and what you're passionate about, the business will come. So thank you again for joining us today. Thank you all for joining, and looking forward to seeing you next time. And until then, be safe, and see you then. Take care.